Hi, welcome to another video that tells the story behind the poems that are in my collection from Between Hindsight and Foresight. Today's poem that we're looking at is called Losing My Senses, and it's from one of 3 Villanelles that are in the collection. Now, Villanelles are a very challenging form to use for any kind of idea, mostly because of the very restrictive rhyme scheme and the refrain of lines throughout the poem. The good thing about Villanelles is that once you have written the first verse, you have half the poem, because the first line of the poem and the third line of the poem are repeated throughout the poem. I am going to do a workshop on the form at some point later on in the year, but I first found the form and enjoyed the specific challenge of the form when I was at university. I had just taken a module on reading poetry, and we had the option at the end of the module of writing another essay, or as our final project, we could write poetry that reflected the course content, reflected things that we had read throughout the module, and explain and analyze and reflect on how our poem was reflecting what we had learned about the poems within the course's content. And of course, because I've been writing poetry since I was a teenager, of course I took up the challenge of writing poems that reflected what I read. And at least 3 of the poems within the collection are from that university project. I wrote one of the poems for that project, and because I liked it, I liked the challenge of it so much, I wrote some more Villanelles later that weren't for the project. Losing My Senses is one of those. I tend to catch a bug with a certain form, and I'll write tons and tons of that particular form with as many ideas as I can think of until it loses interest for me. And not all of the use of that form is always of good quality. In the case of the Villanelles, because of the form is so challenging, all of the ones I had written to date are in the collection because they were still so well crafted. I wanted to include them. Losing My Senses is not my favorite one of the 4 that are in the collection. Losing My Senses is supposed to be about the intimacy between people who are in love. And because the form calls for 5 3-line stanzas and 1 4-line stanza, I thought, oh, well, I will use the 5 senses and pull it together with the emotion at the end. And so it was a very contrived structure. It was a very contrived idea with having a verse for each sense and trying to make it feel emotional at the same time, trying to make it feel that that sensory abandon that we do when we're intimate with someone. And the irony was, this is a completely and totally idealized form, an idealized concept and imagery of intimacy, because at that time I had not experienced that. So this was all what I imagined it to be, what I ideally thought being in love with someone would create, that kind of intimacy, and would create the feeling and the physicality of completely giving yourself over to your senses and your emotion. Sometimes I suppose that's true, but looking back at the poem now, I see how it's not quite as all-consuming as I imagined it to be. And so it's one of those things that you can see it in your head, you can feel it as you read the words, but because for me personally, it lacks a little bit of authenticity. It's not my favorite poem. I like it, and I'm proud enough of it to have included it in my collection. But some of these things you do and you put out there, not because they are perfect, like the rest of us, and like most concepts of intimacy, but because they're imperfect, because you put your heart and your soul into it, and you try to capture something in words to capture something that resonates within you, and you almost get it. It's an elusive idea, trying to capture that all-consuming feeling of intimacy that losing your senses tries to. So it's not often you will hear, I mean, an artist doesn't like every single part of their work. Musicians don't always like every song that they write, even the ones that are the most popular. It's not my favorite poem in the collection, but Losing My Senses does reflect a certain idealistic thought for me of what intimacy could be in a completely abandoned sort of way. So, just a short one today. Thank you for listening to the story of behind Losing My Senses, and look forward to Monday's poll, where you can choose the next story I tell you from the collection. And have a great weekend.